Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Tormented Alliance, American Servicemen and the Occupation of China, 1941 to 1949, by Zach Fredman, narrated by P.J. Ochlan. Introduction. A military alliance with the United States means a military occupation by the United States. That is the truth this book uncovers. It is a conclusion that I resisted over the course of my research. After all, the Annex to Hague 4 of the Hague Regulations of 1907, which remain in force today, defines a territory as occupied only when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. According to this definition, U.S. military commanders never ruled over Great Britain, Australia, or China during the Second World War, when together these three countries hosted several million American servicemen as allies. But the closer I looked at Chinese history, the harder it was to draw any other conclusion. In the end, nearly a decade of evidence documenting the unraveling of the U.S. alliance with nationalist Kuomintang GMD party leader Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China, ROC, during World War II and the Chinese Civil War left me with no other conclusion. To agree to a U.S. alliance from the Second World War on is fundamentally to accede to U.S. occupation. In China, that occupation exposed gaping flaws in the American way of war. Each side brought to the alliance expectations that the other side was simply unable to meet, resulting in a tormented relationship across all levels of Sino-American engagement. By anchoring larger Sino-American struggles over race, gender, and nation, the U.S. military in China transformed itself into a widely loathed occupation force, an aggressive, resentful, emasculating source of physical danger and compromised sovereignty, and, after Japan's surrender and the spring 1946 withdrawal of Soviet forces from Manchuria, the chief obstacle to consigning foreign imperialism in China irrevocably to the past. Both countries still benefited from the alliance-cum-occupation, often against massive odds. With last-minute assistance from the Soviets, the two countries beat Japan into submission without invading its main islands or vanquishing Japanese forces in China. While the war raged, the United States bolstered China's ability to tie down Japanese troops, preventing their redeployment in the Pacific at a relatively low cost. U.S. troop strength in wartime China peaked at around 70,000 men, and the ROC received only 3.2% of America's foreign Lend-Lease aid. Just delivering supplies to China past the Japanese blockade was an enormous logistical challenge, leading to a space-annihilating breakthrough that became a pillar of post-war American power. The Hump Air Bridge connecting India to southwest China across the Himalayas proved, according to its commander, that the U.S. military could fly anything, anywhere, anytime. American air power also helped put an end to the Japanese terror bombing of Chinese cities, including the wartime capital of Chongqing, where Chiang's government fled after the Japanese occupied Nanjing in 1937. The ROC carried out its own unprecedented logistical mobilizations, interpreter and hostel programs that overcame the language barrier and kept American personnel in China housed and fed. These efforts enabled the ROC to emerge from the war with an elite corps of U.S. trained and equipped Army divisions. The alliance facilitated Chinese diplomatic and political gains. In 1943 alone, the United States rescinded its extraterritorial rights in China, ended its anti-Chinese immigration policy, and accepted that all Chinese territories lost to Japan since 1895 would be restored to Chinese sovereignty. 2 years later, the ROC's great power status was affirmed with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. But Chiang lost his country in 1949, and the U.S. military presence contributed to his defeat. In 1942, Chinese welcomed American soldiers as Mengyo, meaning Allied friends. Unlike U.S. troops stationed in the pre-war Chinese treaty ports, these Americans, the Chinese believed, came to China to help crush foreign imperialism, not perpetuate it. Many Chinese elites had aspirations for the alliance beyond Japan's defeat, seeing the U.S. military presence as a means to transform American perceptions of China and uplift the Chinese nation. U.S. officials had a similar vision. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to make China a pillar of a new, non-imperialist post-war order. Army training material for China-bound personnel emphasized racial equality, and senior American commanders believed in their unique capacity to mentor Chiang's armies and impart effectiveness. These lofty ambitions still appeared viable in 1943 in light of China's stunning diplomatic achievements, but by mid-1945 they had crashed and burned. Chinese who came into contact with GIs now felt anger and alienation. The Chinese nationalist government's complicity with the American racism and violent misconduct so blatantly on display in Chinese public life, much of it targeting women, drained Chiang's regime of legitimacy. Most American personnel, for their part, openly dismissed Chinese as thieving, corrupt, ignorant, and filthy chinks and slopes unworthy of American tutelage. The Tormented Alliance staggered on after Japan's surrender with the arrival of 53,000 U.S. Marines and sailors, hailed as liberators in formerly Japanese-occupied coastal cities. But wartime patterns of mutually damaging Sino-American engagement continued, only now occurring in an entirely new geopolitical context, allowing Mao Zedong's communists to harness resentment against the U.S. military presence and deploy it as a powerful tool in their struggle to seize power. By examining day-to-day interactions between American military personnel and an entire spectrum of Chinese, along with efforts by U.S. and Chinese authorities to manage the U.S. military presence, this book offers a new story about the formation, evolution, and undoing of the U.S.-ROC alliance. It is a tale that has never been told before, and one with implications for the present day. Not long after beginning research, I discovered that the rise and fall of the U.S.-ROC alliance turned upon the actions of a much larger cast of characters than scholars have recognized. More than 121,000 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines deployed to China during the 1940s, making this military presence the largest sustained engagement between Americans and Chinese that has ever taken place in China. Only 10,000 Americans lived there before the war, and less than 72,000 were living there in 2010. Yet most studies have reduced this encounter to a story about the contentious relationship between Chiang and General Joseph Stilwell, who served until October 1944 as Chiang's Chief of Staff and commander of U.S. forces in China. Throughout the Cold War and into the early 2000s, popular writers and scholars took Stilwell's disparaging conclusions about Chiang as their starting point, arguing that Chiang's defeat in 1949 resulted from his myopic refusal to follow Stilwell's advice, his corruption and authoritarianism, his unwillingness to fight the Japanese, and his desire to let the Americans win the war for him while he hoarded U.S. aid to fight the Communists. Hans von de Ven's landmark study War and Nationalism in China, 1925 to 1945, demolished what he called the Stilwell myth by documenting the GMD's undeniable contributions to the joint war effort against Japan and Stilwell's profound flaws as a military commander. Subsequent studies by Rana Mitter and Qi Sheng, among others, have bolstered von de Ven's crucial reappraisal of Stilwell and the nationalists. My book adds another dimension to this revisionism by revealing how everyday interactions between U.S. forces and an entire spectrum of Chinese contributed to the unraveling of the relationship from the bottom up. I also learned through my research that it is simply not possible to separate U.S. military support for the ROC during the war against Japan from U.S. military support for the ROC after Japan's surrender. Unlike much of the previous scholarship on wartime Sino-U.S. relations, which takes Japan's August 1945 acceptance of the Allied demand for unconditional surrender as its beginning or end point, this book treats all operations involving or catering to U.S. military personnel in China throughout the decade as an interlocking series of events. President Roosevelt's April 1941 approval of the Chinese government's secret plan to recruit American pilots to defend China's skies as part of the American Volunteer Group, AVG, marked the beginning of U.S. military intervention undertaken to bolster the nationalists. Within weeks, the ROC established its interpreter and hostel programs, which evolved into the nationalist government's key alliance-building initiatives after Pearl Harbor. Japan's surrender did not bring the fighting to an end in China or elsewhere in Asia, nor did it signal the end of U.S. military intervention to shore up the nationalists, which continued on a large scale through January 1947 and did not fully cease until the last Marines departed Qingdao in May 1949. VJ Day made it possible for Americans to regard their job in China as finished, but the transition to peace was not so straightforward. My search for sources connecting operational and lower-level Sino-American interactions to the alliance's high politics took me across mainland China, Taiwan, and Myanmar. I started in Kunming, where I spent weeks trying to decipher a room full of smudgy, handwritten archival finding aids. I began to doubt that I would ever get my hands on an actual archival file, but the records eventually came, and after 3 months of transcribing any file that made reference to American soldiers, I departed with a 96-page Microsoft Word document. For the remainder of my time in China, I tried to be more judicious in my transcriptions, scouring local court, city government, social affairs bureau, garrison command, and police records at municipal and provincial archives from all parts of the country where U.S. troops deployed. Most of these have never been used before. I also pored over newspapers, memoirs, alumni newsletters, local gazettes, and oral history transcriptions. Visits to the Academia Historica in Taipei and the Second Historical Archives in Nanjing yielded central government, foreign ministry, and high-level military records. When battlefield diaries pointed beyond the border, I followed them to Yangon and combed through colonial Burmese intelligence reports from Bamo and Myitkyina. The making and unmaking of the U.S.-ROC alliance left evidence scattered across the United States, including a surprising amount of Chinese language material. Senior commanders donated their papers to well-known repositories such as the Hoover Institution, the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, and the U.S. Marine Corps Historical Center. These archives also contained collections from lower-ranked American officers, non-commissioned officers, and senior Chinese officials, including Chiang Kai-shek. Enlisted soldiers, sailors, and Marines, meanwhile, make up the lion's share of the nearly 500 American China theater veterans who contributed interviews, unpublished memoirs, or wartime records to the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project. The largest collections of wartime U.S. military and diplomatic files from China are stored at the National Archives, with many official ROC records mixed in. A summer-long archival slog in College Park, Maryland, yielded sources that, when analyzed alongside Chinese records about the same events and themes, provide some of the book's most important insights on attitudes and interactions between American and Chinese actors. Many people contributed to the alliance's rise and fall. The American military personnel who served in China came into contact with an eclectic array of Chinese. These included fellow soldiers as well as intellectuals, college students, business owners, rickshaw pullers, police officers, farmers, prostitutes, beggars, smugglers, and thieves. These engagements, and the efforts by ROC and U.S. authorities to manage them, constitute the bulk of the historical record. U.S. forces, too, mirrored the diversity of American society, reflecting the heterogeneity of a citizen army drafted from all regions and walks of life, but for two key exceptions: women and African Americans. No more than 150 women in the Army Nurse Corps and Women's Army Corps served in China, making up less than 0.2% of American troop strength. More than 20,000 black GIs, on the other hand, served in India and Burma, where they loaded cargo aboard China-bound aircraft and built the Ledo Road from Assam to Yunnan, completed in February 1945. But with the exception of a small number of truck drivers permitted to enter western Yunnan temporarily in spring 1945, Chiang barred black American personnel from serving in China, which rendered their indispensable contributions to the Sino-U.S. war effort invisible from the perspective of most Chinese. The process of making and remaking race and gender in wartime China was not a one-way street, and decisions by both U.S. and ROC authorities contributed to the almost entirely male, largely white composition of the U.S. military presence. In the end, my research afforded me more than enough material to write 6 stories spanning World War II and the Chinese Civil War. The first story begins in May 1941, when Chiang ordered Huang Renlin, the American-educated director of the Nationalists' War Area Service Corps, WASC, to establish a network of Western-style hostels for the AVG in Yunnan. This story is vital because the Nationalists expanded the program after Pearl Harbor, aiming to prove their commitment to the alliance by housing, feeding, and providing cultural outreach to all American servicemen in China. Equally important, the Nationalists envisioned the program as a nation-building initiative that combined assimilationist and anti-racist ideas. By insulating American soldiers from China's poverty, demonstrating their capacity for adhering to American dietary, hygienic, and comfort norms, while also showcasing China's cultural achievements, the Nationalists believed they could reshape American perceptions of China and convince their allies to treat them as equals. The program succeeded operationally by keeping U.S. forces housed and fed at Chongqing's expense, thereby crucially contributing to the war effort, but it fell short at the alliance and state-building levels. Hostels failed to insulate the U.S. Army from China's offenses and affronts to the 5 senses. Americans interpreted these sensory encounters and other hostile program shortcomings as evidence of Chinese incapacity, corruption, and untrustworthiness. The program thus became grounds for the Americans to deny the Chinese the equal relationship they wanted. This story comprises the book's first chapter. The effort to operate Western-style hostels was succeeded by another nationalist initiative that facilitated military success against Japan, but failed in its deeper alliance and nation-building aims: the ROC's Interpreter Program. As Chapter 2 details, the Nationalists enabled American soldiers to communicate with other Chinese by cooperating with Chinese intellectuals and Chinese-speaking American missionaries to train more than 3,300 college students and recent graduates to work as military interpreters alongside U.S. forces. But for both Chinese elites and senior U.S. commanders, these interpreters were more than simply a means to facilitate communication. They were also the central figures in realizing their respective visions of how the alliance could and should make China into a modern nation. Both visions were assimilationist, stressing the Chinese interpreter's special role in uplifting the country by introducing American technology and work habits to the Chinese army. But administering the program proved more difficult than Chongqing expected, which eroded interpreter morale and support for the initiative on college campuses. It also heightened tensions with the U.S. Army and exacerbated the paternalism and covert racist prejudices embedded within the American vision. Interpreters, who had been trained to believe their work would reduce American racism, responded by staging frequent strikes against mistreatment at the hands of American personnel in 1945. The U.S. commanders who had viewed interpreters as agents of Americanization now dismissed them as ungrateful children and pressured the GMD to crack down. By the time of Japan's surrender, the interpreter program had helped turn China's educated youth against the U.S. military and the nationalists, a development with important implications for the coming Civil War. The third chapter narrates the story of the U.S. military's efforts to improve the fighting efficiency of Chinese armed forces and carry out joint operations during the war against Japan. It shows how the alliance created a system of political and military vassalage, with the Chinese serving as junior partners, even in outfits like the Sino-American Cooperative Organization, SACO, a secret intelligence partnership with the U.S. Navy that operated under Chinese command. This produced constant tensions and contradictions, culminating in Chiang's fall 1944 showdown with Stilwell. Senior-level military relations improved after Roosevelt relieved Stilwell, but ties among the men in the ranks continued to worsen as Chinese soldiers gained combat experience and became less inclined to play second fiddle to American logistical and support troops. The U.S. military did not deploy ground combat forces in China. Violent confrontations between Chinese and American servicemen increased sharply over the war's final months, even as U.S. Army training programs for Chinese forces and liaison work alongside them on the battlefield convinced both Chiang and Stilwell's replacement, General Albert Wedemeyer, that Sino-American military cooperation had reached new heights. Meanwhile, the self-serving myths Stilwell had popularized in order to justify his chief goal of seizing command over China's armies, that senior ROC military leaders were irredeemably incompetent, while ordinary Chinese soldiers could become capable troops if given proper, read white American leadership and training, lived on after the general's departure, contributing to widespread American resentment against the Chinese military personnel who resisted such designs for enlightenment. The contempt most American military personnel felt toward their Chinese allies was also the product of everyday interactions with Chinese civilians, the subject of Chapter 4. These engagements took place mostly without the mediation of hostile staff or interpreters. They unfolded across southwestern and central China at construction sites where conscript laborers built runways for U.S. aircraft, in remote villages where farmers rescued downed air crews, and above all, in the cities and towns where American soldiers spent their free time. Because U.S. troop strength in China doubled during the first half of 1945, most interaction occurred after Japan's 1944 Ichigo offensive. The acute economic and refugee crises that followed this devastating campaign enlarged the already immense power disparity between American servicemen and local civilians, influencing their engagements in diverse and often indirect ways as ever more Chinese became dependent on the U.S. military for their livelihoods. Rampant theft, offensive sensory encounters, and banditry led American personnel to racialize Chinese civilians with striking speed and consistency. The increasingly draconian, sometimes deadly measures they employed in response to theft provoked outrage, adding to the cumulative effect of civilian anger over forced dislocations, deadly accidents, and violent crimes caused by GIs who were emboldened by their exemption from Chinese law. When cross-cultural cooperation did occur, more often than not it involved smuggling and black market trading, which had a negative effect on military operations. So while a minority of engagements, particularly the power disparity inverting aircrew rescues, strengthened Sino-American relations, the majority contributed to the alliance's unraveling. By spring 1945, the U.S. military had already worn out its welcome in China, but what finally precipitated a violent backlash was public disapproval of sexual relations between American servicemen and Chinese women, the subject of Chapter 5. While the preceding chapters cover the entire war against Japan, this one focuses on 1945, when two interrelated patriarchal narratives about sex emerged in the wake of the Ichigo campaign. Beginning in March, government-backed newspapers began publishing articles and other features criticizing Jeep girls, an epithet coined to describe the increasing number of women who consorted with American troops. Rumors also circulated that GIs were using Jeeps to kidnap respectable women and rape them. Each narrative portrayed women's bodies as territory to be recovered and inextricable from national sovereignty. They resonated widely, making Jeep girls into the catalyst through which all variables causing resentment against the U.S. military intersected and converged. GMD secret police turned a blind eye as Chinese men began attacking GIs and their female companions in mid-April. In speaking to his own troops, Wedemeyer admitted that American misconduct had caused the crisis, but in discussions with Zhang, he blamed it on a Chinese newspaper campaign. With little leverage, Zhang was strong-armed into cracking down on Chinese demonstrators and deploying a preposterous Jeep girl counter-narrative that tarnished his anti-imperialist bona fides. The way the crisis brought tensions surrounding race, gender, and nation to the fore was also a harbinger of struggles to come after Japan's surrender. The final story spans the Chinese Civil War, when U.S. Marines occupied formerly Japanese-held areas in eastern and northern China. From the alliance to the GMD, everything came undone. The moment Japan surrendered, political realities shifted both locally and in terms of the broader geostrategic picture. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, which had grown far more powerful after flooding into areas vacated by the GMD during the Ichigo campaign, hardened its position against the United States. Soviet forces overran Manchuria. American combat veterans of the battle for Okinawa were sent to parts of China where no U.S. forces had been deployed during the war. Tasked with repatriating Japanese forces and helping the nationalists secure these areas ahead of the CCP, they were being used for completely different purposes from what U.S. forces had done in China before Japan's surrender. Sino-American relations on the ground deteriorated along the same patterns that had emerged during the war against Japan, but the entirely new set of dynamics, especially power dynamics, enabled the CCP to weaponize race, gender, and nationalism against the U.S. military and the GMD, particularly after two intoxicated Marines raped a Peking University student on December 24, 1946. Urban public opinion shifted against the nationalists and the Americans, just as U.S. logistical support and military aid facilitated Zhang's ill-advised attempt to recover Manchuria. Each of these stories amplifies a motif in wartime U.S.-China relations that is reflected in America's militarized present. Today, host country governments and the Pentagon spend upward of $20 billion each year to keep American military personnel and their dependents living comfortably at overseas U.S. military bases. In Iraq and Afghanistan, an estimated 50,000 local interpreters have worked with U.S. forces since 2001, accompanying them on nearly all missions outside American outposts. Military training programs, meanwhile, remain a bedrock of U.S. military policy. Despite nearly 2 decades and over $100 billion spent in a largely futile effort to build up Iraqi and Afghan security forces. Outside war zones, displacement, crime, deadly accidents, and military prostitution continue to breed resentment against U.S. troops, while status of forces agreements, SOFAs, shield them from host country laws. When American servicemen rape local women, these resentments can coalesce into large-scale protest movements. But the global military base network endures, as U.S. and host country officials have worked together to make it easier for local populations to tolerate the U.S. military presence and easier for American military personnel to live with them. Thus, while each chapter tells a
Sample complete. Ready to continue?